Welcome, welcome. Hi, everyone. Yay, we're here. Fantastic. Yeah, let me know in chat that you are here. You can hear me. We're ready to go. I love seeing some familiar faces. Hey, y'all. So welcome to the first, or one of the first sessions, the first block for xAPI Party today. My name is Sarah and Sean's with me. We are with Learning Ninjas and we're really excited to share a case study for one of our clients who's actually in the room as well. So Meredith, who just jumped into chat, is actually even wearing her Learning Ninja shirt, which if you have a Learning Ninja shirt, you know the magic of them. They are the softest shirts on the face of the planet. But it's great to see everyone virtually here for the xAPI party. I was sharing with Megan Torrance how it's kind of a bummer that we don't get to see each other in person. They're on site at Torrance Learning. It was a lot of fun to go and get together in the early days and talk about xAPI when this group was much smaller, but super exciting to see how much this group has grown. You know, some of us have been around since xAPI had just started, and we're trying to figure out all the use cases for this and what could we actually do with this. And now it's really cool to see we have tools now that we can use to build statements much easier. We don't have to do all the custom stuff we used to have to do. So what I thought might be useful for today's party is to share a case example with you of an organization that we worked with that just is going through the process of implementing xAPI at an enterprise level. And this is not a very simple case study from the perspective of the implementation because it's global. So we'll talk about that as well. But I just wanted to share with you all that this is a case study for beginners. So I'm going to cover some things for you that gives you some of the basics, things that are super accessible right now when it comes to xAPI, some of the easier stuff you can do. Now, stick around for the rest of the xAPI party, hang out in the cohort. You'll learn about how much you can actually do with xAPI. It's pretty, will blow your mind. But this is just to kind of help you see some basic stuff you can do now that's pretty straightforward and easy to implement. And as I mentioned, my name is Sarah. I am with Learning Ninjas, and we're a consulting organization. We mainly work with organizations to implement xAPI or data strategy approaches to select learning platforms, build out your learning ecosystem from a technology perspective. And then we also work with companies to design and build e-learning. And it could be any kind of online learning solution. So feel free to go check out our website. You can learn more about what we do. We actually have a page that talks about our actual projects if you're interested in work and not just the marketing jargony stuff. And so I'll drop that in chat later so that you can check out some of our work. But what we're talking about today is an organization called GN. And if you've not heard of this organization, you probably know some of the products that they build technology for. So what GN does, it's a global organization, and they are in the communication industry. So anything from hearing, audio, video, gaming, and where you may recognize some of the names in the products that they support are things like hearing aids. So resound or bell tone hearing aids. Also headsets for any of you gamers. You've ever heard of SteelSeries or Jabra headphones? Yes, this is the organization that has Jabra and SteelSeries and also this hearing aid technology. So we've been working with GN for about the last 3 years. And we started out working with them from an opportunity to build some e-learning. We actually started working with them just before the pandemic. We were going to build some little blended learning solutions for an event that they had. And then the pandemic happened, and we ended up shifting an entire in-person event to online. So we ended up building a lot of e-learning, a lot of collaboration opportunities, and evaluating their technology to see what can you do right now. And they were actually delivering a lot of stuff in a very kind of hacked together way as best they could because of the pandemic. So delivering things through a website, right? Through SharePoint, whatever technology they had available to them to deliver any kind of training for a huge product release. And so it was great timing for them to jump into the technology space. It's probably worthwhile to say that this organization is based in Denmark, and they are all over the world. So if you can think of any kind of major country, any language, we're using it. So there are 7 primary languages that we build content for. Obviously English, US and UK English is the primary. French, German, Spanish, so forth. And then what they were engaging in is back in 2020, when the pandemic happened, they started to shift towards a more centralized training model. They had an LMS internal, which I'll let Meredith and Julie, who are here, tell you how they feel about Workday, but that's what they use for internal training. And we helped them identify and build their requirements for their external LXP that they use with their markets. So all the folks who buy their products all over the world, how would we connect them with training about products? We chose Learn Upon, or I would say the selection process resulted in Learn Upon as their learning experience platform. Their tool set that they use internally consists of your typical rapid development tools. So you've got Articulate 360, Camtasia, Adobe Captivate, Creative Cloud, so forth. Yeah, David, we'll talk about in just a minute. We are not using xAPI for internal training. We're only going to talk about the external training to the market. So great observation there. I do think it's worthwhile to share that the training team at GN is made up of audiologists, brilliant people who are doctors, right? So these are not e-learning developers. These are folks that are sharing their expertise primarily in a classroom setting or an in-person setting. And so when we started to work with GN, what we found was that there was this desire to learn about how can we deliver this stuff in a more asynchronous format so we can scale out. So that's just a little bit of foundation about our project background with them. Now, over the period of working with them, we have identified all of these different opportunities to get a better understanding of how the different markets are using their training. Now, I mentioned that they use Workday for their internal learning platform, their LMS, and then they use Learn Upon for their external LXP. For this discussion, we're going to focus on the external training that they are delivering. So just on external training through Learn Upon, which is their learning experience platform. So here's the xAPI journey. These are the steps, the basic steps that we have gone through to date to set up GN for xAPI. So the first step was to establish their data strategy. So what are the questions that you want to answer that you don't have answers to? What do you want to know about your training and the impact that it has for your organization? The second step was the technology assessment. Now, I do want to share that you can do these steps in any order, and you tend to revisit certain areas as you go through the process, to be fair. But the technology assessment was really just to say, okay, what's all the stuff that you're using right now? And maybe not even training specific stuff. I want to know, as an organization, what is the technology that you have access to? What are the things that if somebody's already gotten approved to use in some way or another? I want to know everything. And then the third step was our LRS setup. So what learning record store do we need? And how do we go ahead and get that set up? We set up our profiles. So how do we define and document the verbs and extensions? So that way we can be consistent. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And then content and testing. So what's our content going to look like? How do we ensure that it's all xAPI enabled and that it's giving us data that we want to learn from and that's working seamlessly? So how do we create that content? How do we keep track of it? How do we test our statements? So that's what we're working through right now. Meredith, you might want to, you might want to address that in the chat, whether the LRS process was smooth. I'll tell you that we didn't really ask. We just told them what we were going to do. But Meredith can probably speak more to that, what happened on the back end. So let's break down each of these steps. Well, what did we actually do in these different steps? So first was data strategy. And Sean and I worked with Meredith and Julie and China, who's also on their team, the training team. We got together in person and we worked through data strategy questions. What are the things that you want to know? Now, I'll share with you that a lot of what informed this discussion was the requirements that we put together for the learning platform when we went through the process of selecting Learn Upon for the LXP for their external training. Part of what informed this discussion was, why did we need a platform in the first place? What were you trying to do? What were you trying to accomplish? What are your business goals in delivering that training? So let's talk a little bit about that. I want to know, what is it that you want to know about your training efforts that you can't answer now? For those of you who are using typical LMSs, you're probably getting pass, fail, complete, incomplete. Maybe you're seeing like pass or fail or complete, incomplete based on slide views. So you can kind of tell how far they got or didn't get roughly. But you're probably not getting much, very specific data if you're just using a typical LMS with SCORM alone. So what are some of the things that we would want to know? Well, here's just a little clip from some of the questions that we wanted answers to. We wanted to know some information that was coming from Salesforce. What are the accounts that are being trained? They use Salesforce for their sales platform, and as many people do. And that's how they handle their external training or sales training. And so we wanted some information about, well, what happens? How many of these accounts have been trained after a product launch, 30, 60, and 90 days after? And that's something that for those of you who are in a typical or in kind of an old school training setup, in order to get this data, you would have to either find a way to pull this information from Salesforce, or you'd have to force them to go through your LMS and take some kind of training that way. Second thing is, did they go to a training page? Now, something important to know about how GN chose to set up their training is that they implemented all of their training through the portal that their markets use, their website that their markets already use. They put the training where the people were. So even though they're using Learn Upon as their learning management system or their learning experience platform, they are using an API to connect that training to the site where people are already going to be. So they just added a training page to it, which is really great because that integrates it into the current workflows that the markets are already using. And it added that training. So now we want to know, did they go to that training page? How many visits were there? Interactions with content. Did they actually click through to the content? We wanted to know some information about, did they access resources, whether it was through their WebDAM, which is like a CMS, a content management system with all of their documentation. Did they access information from there or through Learn Upon? And then there's some other subjective information, but I share this with you because if you look at this from an xAPI perspective, you may start to have some ideas about, oh, I can collect some of this data in a consistent format in one place now. So I can start to figure out, what questions do I want to have answered? Where does that data come from? Where does it live? And then can I use xAPI to now pull all that data into one place? So just something to start thinking about. All right. Second step was our technology assessment. And that was going through and assessing all of the technology they had available to them. So here are a couple screenshots. Essentially, there were two big things I wanted to get out of this from an xAPI perspective. The first one was that, Sean and I and our team, we wanted to figure out, what are all the potential activity providers where xAPI data may come from? Now, if you haven't been in the xAPI space for very long, you think about activity providers, those are going to be the places where statements can be generated or created. Sean, do you want to speak to activity providers a little bit?
Yeah. So, one of the major things with the activity providers, as you alluded to, Sarah, is just making sure that you are documenting anywhere that you could possibly get statements from. It might be a down the road type thing, but you at least want to know that, I say statements, but really anywhere that you're getting data from. I always look at this as something where I want to know all the data sources that we're going to be potentially integrating with, looking at the data as a way to correlate what we've been doing back to training, and potentially getting xAPI statements from those. But documenting all of those sources of potential data will help you in the long run and give you, in some cases, a really complex ecosystem map. In other cases, something really simple. But at least you have this documented so that as you're moving forward, you know where you're going to be comparing things, what your potential sources of data will be.
Yeah, Sean. And Christine has a really great comment in the chat. And let me know in chat, Christine, if I misinterpret. But this is something that as a beginner, you don't know what you don't know. And actually, Meredith has literally said this to me before. I don't know what I don't know. So help me with this. So think about it from this perspective, Christine. When you are trying to pull together answers to those previous questions, think about all of the platforms you use. So the chart that you see here on the screen on the right, we literally just said, go into your computer, your web browser, and tell me every bookmark for every piece of software you have. What software do you have downloaded on your computer? That's literally what our technology assessment looks like. What's every tool that you use on a day-to-day basis? And, Julia and Meredith, specifically, since they're here, they were like, okay, well, here's this. Do you mean the stuff I use for training? I said, no, just what do you open Outlook? Right? Do you open Google? Like, what are the things that you use every day? And we start to establish this really long list of all the technology that a person in that organization uses on a day-to-day basis. And then we can start to say, there's probably some really interesting information that comes out of this, right? From the perspective of like a help desk. You got people calling into the help desk about problems that they have in the markets. So what are some of the stuff that comes out of that? So if you see there on the chart, what we did is we logged, here's all the technology, and here's what GN folks in the organization are using that software or platform for. And then we will start to make some notes about, this would be a really good place to get some information about sales data. This would be a really good place to get information about all of the issues that people are having and why are they calling into the help desk, right? What you see here on the left is mapping out the learning ecosystem. So this is where we start to map out, here's kind of the flow that somebody would go through in a typical training. Right? So then we start to get more specific to the learning ecosystem. Here's like a use case or a case example of how I flow through training in this organization, and I map all that flow out. And then I can start to identify gaps, right? Then I can start to say, oh, I'm missing a step here. I'm missing some technology here. I can start to map that out. Now, I do want to be very transparent in that, my team has been doing this for a very long time. Sean's been doing it longer even than I have. And so if you think about, going through this process, there's a lot that you can do on your own. But that's why the people like, having the cohort or reaching out to organizations that might be able to help consult you through the process, just a little bit of help goes a long way. Like it doesn't have to be a huge investment. Even just a little bit of consulting help can go a long way. Sean, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, well, I guess one little thing, and that is just, again, I think to your point, Sarah, is you don't know what you don't know sometimes. And I can tell you from doing other projects with xAPI, this step typically for me is usually obviously in this case, you're seeing our process, but it's a very early step because this is going to help define the data strategy. So I think about ecosystems all the time. Early on, we had a project that I worked on a long time ago that it basically, through the technology assessment and the data strategy, completely turns the project around from what the customer was thinking it was going to be, from, oh, this is a training issue, to, well, actually, if we got into the, this was a form, if we actually got into the form itself and got some data out of that, yes, it's a training issue, but we can actually see where the training is making a difference by getting into this HTML form instead of doing all of this other stuff in the background to try and figure out if training was working.
I love that, Sean, because, and Dana, I agree with you in chat. So when you start to think about training and what we do in training, especially with technology, y'all know that everything doesn't happen in our platforms. People learn from a whole lot of other places than just our LMS or whatever stuff we put together. So it's really starting to say, like, where does work get done? Where do we start to see the results of the things that we do, right? How can we start to tie some of this together to tell us a bigger picture about how things are happening? So I want to break this down a little bit more and make it more practical. So let's get into the next step, which is going to be our LRS setup. So when we talk about setting up our LRS, we had a little bit of fun with this. When you're selecting and implementing a learning record store, the first thing that I'll share with you is that you can do anything from hosting your own to paying somebody to host one for you. And there is a wide range of services that you're going to see with different LRS providers. So the first thing you've got to establish is, what does this process even look like for you? And test some out, because most of your LRS providers are going to have some version of a sandbox that you can start to play around with it and see, how's this working for me? So what we did for GN, we started off with Yet Analytics. We started out with Yet. And the reason why we started out with Yet is because they have amazing visualization tools. So if you're thinking about getting an LRS, then Yet is one of the ones you should look at, because they have really, really great visualization. They're a great LRS. They've been around forever. But what we ran into with this project is we had just set up the sandbox and we were about to start testing for a product launch. And guess what happened? If any of you are in the xAPI space, you probably know what I'm about to say. But about a week before we were going to launch, we got an email from Yet saying, hey, folks that are on our sandbox, we're shutting this down next week. And so we panicked for a second and we were like, okay, we've got to figure out what we're going to do. But we only panicked for a second, because the beauty of this, it wasn't firewall issues. No, what Yet did is that they shifted to, rather than doing a hosted sandbox, they made their sandbox data available for you to set up on your own. And Sean, I don't know if you want to speak to that any.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a shift, like you said, Sarah, to an open source. Couple different versions. The major one, I think, for most of us that have been here for a while, was a SQL-based LRS. Yeah, it was just a major kind of shift in moving to the way that they deployed their LRS options.
Right. And it was I'm sure it was a business decision. I think for us, we just panicked because we were like, oh crap, we have a week. But here's what I want to share with all of you. Do you know how easy it is to change to a new LRS? It is so easy that literally all we had to do is change the endpoint. So we switched over to Veracity. Veracity has a hosted LRS LRS sandbox that you can use. And we went out, I called Jason, hey, over at Veracity, I said, hey, we need to switch over. What do you all have available for a sandbox right now? And they said, oh, we got a great sandbox. Here are the visualizations. You can do up to this many statements. And I said, this will be great for our pilot and our product launch on this. Let's test this out. So we switched over to Veracity. All we had to do was change our endpoint and we were set up. Now, I want to backtrack just for a moment. If you remember, we were using Learn Upon for the LXP. And Learn Upon has its own data. I guess it's not really an LRS, but they have their own analytics built in, and they do use xAPI. But it's not a true LRS. So what we had to do in Learn Upon is we had to connect the LRS to Learn Upon. And the beauty of that, we will talk about in just a minute. I'm going to leave that out there as a teaser, but just keep in mind that connecting this with your learning platform, your current learning platform, has a lot of benefits if your LMS or LXP, whatever acronym you want to use, if it has the ability to communicate with your LRS. Now, there's CMI5 and there are other things that you can do, and there are other folks that are going to give presentations, but from a beginner's perspective, reach out to your LMS platform, whatever platform you use, and see, can you integrate with xAPI? because it can be as simple as switching your endpoint and having the data now export somewhere else or send somewhere else. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you already have a bunch of statements in your current LRS, most LRS vendors will allow you to export all your statements out and import them into the new LRS. One of the beautiful things about xAPI is interoperability. And if you've not heard the word interoperability before, what that means, if you've ever implemented an LMS and you've seen the nightmare that you have to go through to get your content from one LMS to another, then you know what happens when you don't have interoperability. So it's really nice to work with xAPI because you can easily move your data from one learning record store to another. So that was our LRS selection and setup. We actually have, I mean, the world's your oyster. You can pick whatever LRS you want. You can play around with them and switch from one to another and just see what you like the best. All right. So next step of our journey was our profile. And profiles are something that, in my experience in working with xAPI, because I've been working with xAPI since like 2013 or 14. And so when you think about xAPI, profiles are a thing that like a bunch of people talk about, but I want to share with you a practical way to build a profile. So what profiles are meant for is so that you can establish a way of being consistent with the way that you are reporting out your statements and how you interpret them. Now, here is an example of a profile, and this is the profile that we started to set up for GN. So we've just started setting up the profiles. And we did this, what you're seeing here is just Airtable. You can use whatever you want to document your profiles. You could use Excel or, I don't know, a sheet of paper, whatever you want to use. But the point of creating a profile is that you establish a consistent way to use these different verbs, that you establish a consistent way, because what's going to happen is all of these statements are going to be sent to the LRS. And how do you know how you're using each verb? Now, the first step that we took in establishing the profile is we pulled all of the verbs that are available to you in Storyline. We pulled all of the verbs that are available to you in Storyline and Rise, right? And we listed them all out. So these are all the ones that you have available to you. Now, for those of you who work in xAPI, you can pick any verb you want in the whole wide world and create an IRI for it. Yes, we know that. But if you're a beginner and you're going to use tools you have available to you, you should probably start with creating a profile for the verbs that you have access to. Yes, David, yes. And Jeff Batt actually has a really good presentation on creating custom verbs. So yes, keep that in mind. And we can talk about that in a second. So we pulled all of the verbs that are your pick list from Storyline. The second step was that we said, here are the ones that you should probably avoid because they're super generic, especially at this point in xAPI. Things like attempted, experienced, and progressed. They're system-generated verbs, meaning that most tools that have just so let me step back a minute. Y'all know that you've been able to send xAPI or publish things for xAPI for several years now, from Captivate and Storyline and everything. You could publish for xAPI for a while. The problem was that the statements that got sent were garbagey statements. They weren't super helpful. And the statements are going to be sent with some system-generated verbs. So we wanted to just acknowledge the fact that you're going to see some verbs come through to your LRS or some statements come through to your LRS that are system generated that you did not necessarily set up, that the tool itself created the content and is going to report it that way. So now we have the rest of, not necessarily David, but then we have the rest of the verbs here. These are the ones that we can assign as we're building something in Storyline. We can assign what those verbs mean. Why do we create a profile? The reason we create a profile is that there are several of these verbs that I can use to mean the same thing. I could say that you attempted something, which is system generated. And I can also say that you, let's see, we've got progressed, we've got experienced. Like experienced and attempted could technically mean the same thing. You've got satisfied and completed. Satisfied and completed could mean the exact same thing. So how are you using these verbs? When you set up your content, how did you decide to use those verbs? And you should document it, because guess what happens? These start getting sent to the LRS, and then you start to visualize them and you're like, hold on, this is showing that I have like 8,000 completions, but I only have 300 people that took it, right? Because you've got verbs that are reporting multiple things. So you have to be very clear in how you set these up. We have another project right now that we're working on that's using Learning Pool, and they have things sent to Learning Locker, which is another learning record store, another LRS. And Learning Locker, because of the way that they had it set up and just by default, they've got multiple completions, they've got multiple attempts, they've got things that are reporting duplicates, because in the visualization, it's showing all of those verbs in one visualization. It's saying, okay, show me anything. I want to know how many people have completed stuff. So show me anything that says completed or satisfied or progressed through or whatever. And they're picking multiple verbs in that visualization, and it's giving them skewed data. And now, so let me let Sean add on to this a little bit.
Yeah, it's sorry, we were just having a conversation around verbs and profiles in the chat there, but you know, it's where it really becomes, to Sarah's point, really important that everyone is using consistency. And I know Stephen had asked about, you know, should it be on the profile server? And potentially, yes. If you're looking at it from an industry perspective, you know, you look at something, you know, like the medical industry and the profiles that they've created. Yes, those are super important to be on the profile server, because that's what's going to drive consistency across the entire, God, I lost the word, but the profession. So, you know, when we have mannequins and you're you know, using mannequins to develop or to deliver xAPI statements, it's really important that all the manufacturers use the same, you know, the same verbs in there, so that when you go to do analytics, it doesn't matter who it came from. You're going to be able to query by the same verbs and filter by the same verbs and make sure that they, you know, everybody knows the definition of those. When we talk about this particular case, we're really talking about a profile that's internal to GN and what they were doing, and really using it for consistency across developers, so that we could say, okay, when someone finishes a course, we're going to make sure that it's passed, and everybody's going to use passed every single time, so that we can use that as a query point when we're doing analytics. And that's really the super important part of this. And the really big reason why it's important to document this, because not only is it the verb that you're using, but why you're using it. Because the person you're going to have to tell in 6 months is you. So why did we pick past over this other thing? Okay, I've documented that, and I've got that in front of me now, and I understand why we did that. So it becomes really important when you get to that. So could it be generic enough for the automobile-based industry, David? It very well could be. You know, I don't know that we're quite there yet to be able to say, yeah, everybody, we're going to go out and use this. So that could be something that we use in the future.
Right. And I think it's probably useful to refer to, does your industry have a profile? This is where being involved in the cohort can be helpful, and reaching out to support for folks that have been doing this for a while. Is there a profile that's already been established for your industry? Are you going to go create something really cool, custom sending xAPI statements? Could that inform what you choose as your verb setup for whatever you're creating? Yes, possibly, if your industry has a profile. And some of the major industries do have some profile work that has been done, some more than others. So yes, it could certainly inform it. From a beginner's perspective, the only thing we want you to take away from this at this point is you need to document how you're using your verbs, because otherwise it's going to come back to bite you. And like Sean said, you're probably going to be the one that forgets how you used your own verb. So it's a really good way to keep track of this. I'll also share with you, since you came to this session today, I'm going to share this template with you so you can download it. So I have made this available for all y'all. I'll give it to you at the end. Okay. Our next step in the journey is going to be content and testing. And there are just a couple of things I want to share with you around content and testing, because if you have a very specific use case or project you're wanting to build, I highly encourage you to jump into the cohort and say, I have a project I want to build. And it's a great way to get a bunch of volunteers to help you work for free. So if you want to work on something specific, jump into the cohort, get involved, and have somebody help you with that project. But from the perspective of this case study, I want to share with you what I feel is very important from a content and testing perspective to keep up with as you're building stuff. Now, this is a rough setup for how GN is currently working from a training perspective. So that diagram that I showed you earlier about technology and the workflow, this is how it's set up. So most of their content today is being built either in Rise or in Storyline. That content is being pushed through a website that is the market for that market. So there's a Spanish one and a German one and a French one and a whatever in English, and all the different markets have their own site page that was built in a Sitecore. So that website page is how they're accessing the training through Sitecore. Actually, this is a little bit not exact, because technically Learn Upon should be going to Sitecore. I think I have this swapped around. So all of the content is being loaded in Learn Upon and it's being pushed to Sitecore. Long term, and we mentioned this earlier, they do want to get some Salesforce data too, and there is a plugin that allows them to gather Salesforce data so that that will actually go through Learn Upon to Veracity as well. So there are lots of things that they're going to be able to do with this. But essentially, all of this ends up in their LRS. All the data ends up in their LRS. They do have some data analytics in Learn Upon they can use as well. But this is the ecosystem that they're using together. Now, if we know that all of their content is currently being built in either Rise or in Storyline, you all know that that is super limited from an xAPI perspective. Storyline is now opened up to where you can create custom statements, right? So you're going to be able to do a lot of xAPI stuff with Storyline, but it's still going to be somewhat limited unless you know JavaScript. So the other thing that you're going to have is Rise, and that's going to have just a whole bunch of canned statements, because right now you cannot modify the statements in Rise unless you modify the published file, the output of the Rise package, which is, if you're a beginner, then that's technical, and we could talk about that a different time. We had more time. So we're looking at some content that's being sent through that is Rise content, basic statements, and then we have some stuff that we can build in Storyline that's being sent through. So the first thing we need to know is, where is that content coming from and what can we build with it? The next thing that you need to know is that from a content perspective, you're going to need to start keeping track of your identifiers. I have this blurred out just because this is a real example, but this is a real example of one of their modules that was built in Rise. When you publish stuff out from Rise, because it is not going to allow you to create custom statements or do a lot of stuff with it, it's going to give you just canned statements. You're going to need to grab the identifier that is in this Rise file before you publish it. So when you export that file, for those of you who use Articulate, you need to grab that identifier. And you need to save it somewhere so that you know that this identifier is this course or this module. And I'm just giving you current state, y'all. This may change later, but this is current state. So what we did is we have them tracking everything in a content inventory. This is, again, an Airtable. You can track it wherever you want. But we have them putting in all of the names of the modules. And, of course, they're in different languages, too. So this becomes, for every module, you have, like, multiple modules, translated modules. And then we have all of the xAPI IDs. Why do you think it's important for us to keep track of this? Well, because anytime we have anything in Rise, we're going to need to be able to track back that ID to what module it belongs to. So let me show you a statement. So this is going to be an example of a site page. Let's pretend that I go out. This is the Spanish version. Let's say that I go out to their site page. I go access some training, and I select one of these training modules. When I select the training module, I take it, that data in the background is getting collected by LearnUpon, and any xAPI statements are being sent to the LRS. So all of that is happening in the background, real time. Here's an example of a statement for one of these modules. So I can see in the breakdown of this statement, and I apologize if this is the first time you're ever seeing an xAPI statement, don't freak out, let's walk through it. So the top part, you're gonna see that there's a timestamp here. So I see when this statement was reported. I can also see who actually took that module or who was doing it. That actor information, that's actually coming from LearnUpon. The reason why I'm able to grab that actor is because Kelly was logged into LearnUpon through that SSO. So that single sign-on that they have set up on their webpage, all that passes through LearnUpon and is able to be reported through xAPI to the LRS. So a lot of this stuff, when we talk about interoperability and the current state of our tools, y'all, if you can get a learning platform that is xAPI conformant, and if you can get an LRS that can connect in and you can do it, I mean, all this stuff happens automatically for you now, whereas it used to be a really manual process. So really exciting. I can see that Kelly passed, and I can see down here in the object, she passed an activity, but here's my ID. I don't know what she passed unless I go look up that ID and match it back to the module that this is. Now, this is only happening with Rise right now in their setup. If it was Storyline, I would see the course name. But because Rise is giving me canned statements, unless I went into the published file and modified it after publishing, I'm just going to see an ID. And because I'm working, everyone at GN, remember, audiologists, right? I'm trying to make it as simple for them as possible. So I'm not going to try to teach. I'm sure Julie and Meredith would probably freak out a little bit if I said, okay, now we're going to start teaching you HTML to have you modify all this stuff on the back end. So all we want to do is just keep track of those IDs for now. And hopefully, as our tools improve, we'll have better data come from this, right? Anything, Sean, you would add here?
No, nothing.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is what we're seeing pass through to the LRS. And then I get some roll-up data. So if I want to visualize this in my LRS, then I'm going to need that activity ID so I can build a visualization, and I know this is everything for this module in Spanish. This is everything for this module in German or whatever. And I can start to build some visualizations about what people are doing in those different modules. Even though it's limited in Rise, I still have some data that I want to collect even from Rise. Because I'm getting stuff, I'm getting how far they progress through. I'm getting a lot of data. It's just, I'm not getting a lot of human readable data, if that's helpful. So what's next for GN? Well, some of the things we're doing now is we want to analyze some of this data and figure out what our visualizations are going to be as we roll out this first product launch, because they are just now rolling out this whole process this year. They've got an upcoming product launch that we're getting ready for, and we want to start to figure out what data is coming through. Do we need to make any adjustments to our plan, right? So we're going to start to learn some things, set some benchmarks. We're going to also build a custom project in Storyline. Right now, the majority of their content is in Rise because they have to quickly get stuff out to these markets around product knowledge and product changes. But there are some things that we want to build in Storyline as far as how they interact with like fitting software and things like that, that we're wanting to test out and see what kind of data we get from that. We're also going to eventually, probably within the next 8 to 12 months, start to integrate some of that Salesforce data so that we can answer some of these questions around training that's happening in the markets and integrate that back in to what we're doing. Because remember, we're trying to centralize this training model now and figure out how we can best support the markets. We're also going to continue to refine that data strategy and revisit it as business goals may change and adjust. And then we're going to have to move to a full-featured LRS. So right now we're in a sandbox. That's not going to happen long-term, right? Eventually you're going to max out statements. So eventually we're going to have to figure out what LRS do we want to end up in. And that's what we're testing right now. Which one is going to give us the visualizations and the functionality that we want? There are 2 resources that I promised to share with you. One is going to be our site, learnxapi.com. There is a course series that is going to be available probably within the next month that you can get access to. That course will take you through all of the steps from data strategy, like how to build a data strategy, all the things we talked about today from a beginner's perspective, even through to building and reporting a statement. So it takes you through the entire process, and it's all asynchronous. So it'll all be from an e-learning perspective. So you can sign up to get on the mailing list, and we will let you know when that's available. So you can go to learnxapi.com to sign up. And then we also have access to that content inventory tracker that has the place where you can keep track of all of your modules or your courses. And then also that tab for the xAPI profile. That's going to be in that second link. So it's a bit.ly, it's xAPI content. If you don't use Airtable, you can also download that as a CSV. So you can go out and access that as a free download. If anyone has any questions or there's anything we could do to support you, here's how you get in touch with us at Learning Ninjas. We're very excited that we were invited to share this case study with you today, and big thanks to GN for allowing us to share their case study with you all. And hopefully we'll have more exciting things to report out in the coming months. So thanks, everyone. And thanks, Sean, for joining me too.
Yeah, thanks all.